In November 1940-3, on a coral island barely 2 miles long in the Central Pacific, more than 1,000 American soldiers fell dead within 70-6 hours. 3 months later, on another coral island larger in size and just as heavily defended, only 370-2 Americans lost their lives. The two islands shared similar terrain and comparable enemy fortifications, yet the outcomes could not have been more different. 620-8 soldiers walked off the battlefield alive because of a single change. Had they fought under the conditions of 3 months earlier, every one of them would have perished. What turned the tide was not a new weapon, not reinforcements, and certainly not luck. It was a set of tactical principles that had been written into a document 10 years before either island appeared on any battle map. The man who created these principles never made a single newspaper headline during the entire war. His name was Holland McTyeire Smith, a man rejected by the Army who became the father of amphibious warfare. On April 20th, 1880-2, Smith was born in the small town of Hatch-e-Chubby-E, Alabama. His father was a seasoned lawyer who served as a state legislator and later became chairman of the Alabama Railroad Commission. The Smith family had no military tradition whatsoever. No uniform ever hung on their walls, and no ancestor could be found who had ever served. Every indication pointed to a future far removed from military life. He attended Alabama Polytechnic Institute and the University of Alabama Law School, earning a science degree in 1901 and a law degree in 1903. Then he practiced law in Montgomery for a year. In those days, a small minus-down lawyer's son from the South followed a perfectly respectable path through life. Then fate quietly intervened. In 1904, Smith applied to join the United States Army, but was turned away because the quota was already full. So the following year, he applied to the Marine Corps instead. The man who would one day be hailed as the father of modern American amphibious warfare entered military service only because the Army had rejected him. During his early service, he was dispatched to remote corners most Americans could not find on a map: the Philippines, Haiti, the Dominican Republic. He participated in small scale engagements and campaigns that were slowly being forgotten. The units frequently landed on uncharted beaches because no one considered advanced reconnaissance particularly important. But mission after mission, Smith noticed the same recurring problem whenever enemy forces defended a landing beach. Even if they were lightly armed and outnumbered, American soldiers always suffered avoidable casualties. During one operation in the Philippines, the landing force missed its designated landing point, whether due to an error on the chart or a failure to verify coordinates. The water that was supposed to be knee-minus deep turned out to be chest-minus deep. By the time the soldiers struggled through the water to reach the tree line, the element of surprise was completely gone, and 2 soldiers died. They were killed not by enemy action, but by oversight. The landing site was wrong, the timing was disorganized, naval and shore fire support were completely uncoordinated, and the military had no contingency plan in place. When the original plan went wrong, everyone was helpless. But on the battlefield, plans going wrong was the norm. From that point on, Smith began quietly recording problems. No one asked him to do this, but he kept at it relentlessly. While stationed in the Dominican Republic in 1916, his men gave him the nickname Howl and Mad because he would harshly reprimand soldiers for even minor mistakes during training. The nickname stuck, but his severity was never without reason. He understood deeply that cutting corners on the training ground would cost lives on a real beachhead. He had witnessed tragedy unfold with his own eyes, and he was determined to prevent it from happening again. In 1915, the Gallipoli campaign erupted in Turkey. British and French forces launched a massive amphibious assault against heavily defended shores. The campaign dragged on for 8 months. The Allies suffered 250,000 casualties, and they were ultimately forced into a full retreat. Afterward, mainstream military institutions across the Western world reached a definitive conclusion. Launching an amphibious assault against a coast with fully constructed defensive works was not merely difficult. it was pure fantasy. This was not something that could be solved by optimizing plans or grading equipment. It was fundamentally impossible at the tactical level. For the next 20 years, this conclusion was written into military textbooks and went virtually unchallenged. Smith collected every available battle report, operational summary, and casualty analysis from the Gallipoli campaign. Other officers read the same materials and became even more convinced that the existing conclusion was correct. But Smith identified 5 clear and specific failures from the chaos. He believed the disaster had nothing to do with luck and was not because the soldiers were outmatched. It was 5 systemic problems that could have been anticipated and corrected in advance. The misuse of naval gunfire. At Gallipoli, warships fired from too far offshore and used the wrong ammunition. High-minus explosive shells fired at long range struck thick, concrete fortifications of nearly flat trajectories, detonating on impact and producing nothing but smoke, craters, and noise. They could not damage the structures at all. The defenders inside the bunkers remained completely unharmed, and when the shelling stopped and landing craft approached the beach, the enemy was still fully ready. To destroy concrete fortifications, armor-piercing shells fired at proper angles with sustained fire were required, and this battle failed to do any of that. Second, hidden reefs were not surveyed. No underwater reconnaissance teams were sent before the battle. No one measured water depths, mapped channels, or marked coral reefs that lurked just below the surface and would block heavily loaded landing craft. When the landing craft surged forward, large numbers ran aground far from shore. Soldiers had to jump into deep water, still hundreds of yards from the beach, while enemy machine guns were already aimed at the killing zone. Third, the different branches operated in complete disconnection. The Navy, Air Forces, and ground troops each followed their own plan. Their timetables were never synchronized. Naval gunfire would stop, but the aircraft responsible for suppressing beach defenses had not yet arrived. By the time the planes flew overhead, soldiers on the beach had already been taking casualties for 20 minutes. 3 branches, 3 separate battle plans, and no one coordinating anything in the critical moment. Fourth, the command structure was chaotic. The overall battlefield commander was far away on a warship with limited communications, unable to grasp the real -time situation on the beachhead. Frontline commanders had no authority to make decisions on their own. Every move required approval from a superior at sea, and by the time orders arrived, the window of opportunity had already closed. Fifth, there were no specialized landing vehicles. The landing craft soldiers rode and were designed for transport, not for assault. They had flat bottoms and shallow drafts, and the moment they hit a coral reef, they ran aground. Soldiers had to jump overboard and wade through deep water, fully loaded and slow, completely exposed to enemy fire. Smith recorded each of these 5 failures and began formulating corresponding solutions. He firmly believed that Gallipoli's defeat was not a failure of Amphibious' assault itself, but a failure of preparation and execution. If reefs were surveyed in advance, command was unified, armor-piercing shells delivered sustained bombardment, and specialized landing craft were provided, amphibious assault was entirely feasible. This judgment was considered heresy at the time, but Smith never wavered. In 1930, Smith joined the faculty of the Marine Corps Schools at Quantico, Virginia. Here he gained a crucial opportunity to systematically organize his amphibious warfare concepts. In 1930-4, he led the writing of the Tentative Manual for Landing Operations, a document that for the first time redefined amphibious assault from an impossible mission to a tactical operation requiring meticulous preparation. The core principles of the manual included extending naval bombardment duration and switching entirely to armor-piercing shells, dispatching underwater reconnaissance teams to survey reefs and channels before battle, establishing a unified beachhead command structure, providing specialized landing craft, and attacking from the weakest direction of defense. However, after the manual was written, not a single naval commander adjusted operational plans based on it. Not a single dollar of military funding was allocated for it. Not a single general reformed training around it. A doctrine that had never been tested in combat remained just words on paper. Starting in 1930-5, Smith began using live exercises to validate the tactics. These were called fleet landing exercises, and they continued every winter without interruption. In February 1930-5, the first fleet landing exercise took place on Culebra Island in the Caribbean. Landing craft ran aground on unsurveyed reefs, troops landed on the wrong beaches, and coordination between naval gunfire and infantry completely collapsed within the first 30 minutes. Smith faithfully recorded every problem, not to assign blame, but to precisely analyze which parts of the tactical doctrine worked and which had gaps, then systematically corrected them unprepared for the second exercise. In January 1930-6, the second exercise was held on Vieques Island, Puerto Rico. Inter-service coordination improved, but there were still not enough landing craft. Some vessels still ran aground on reefs, and soldiers had to jump overboard and wade the remaining distance under simulated enemy fire. In a real battle, fully loaded soldiers moving slowly through water would be completely exposed to enemy machine gun fire. Smith recorded the problems again and refined the solutions. Over the next 3 years, the third through fifth exercises were conducted in succession. Old problems steadily diminished, but new challenges kept emerging. Whenever the exercise scale approached that of a real battlefield, beachhead logistics would completely break down. The first wave had barely landed when follow minus on units arrived right behind them, instantly clogging the beach. Supplies that frontline troops desperately needed piled up at the waterline, unable to reach the soldiers in time. Commanders could barely communicate with their units. In a real battle, this kind of chaos would inevitably cause massive casualties. Moreover, during the most intense moments when the situation was changing by the minute, radio communications between the command ship and beachhead forces frequently went dead. Smith still persisted in recording and correcting. In early 1940, the sixth exercise was held on San Clemente Island, California. Tracked amphibious landing vehicles were used in live-fire exercises for the first time. These vehicles were not stopped by reefs. Their tracks could grip coral and keep moving forward, successfully solving the years-old problem of conventional landing craft running aground. Smith formally submitted a request to purchase tracked amphibious vehicles in bulk, but it was rejected due to insufficient budget. In the summer of 1940-1, the seventh exercise took place at New River, North Carolina. This was the largest exercise to date, with an entire division simultaneously executing the full amphibious tactical system. The exercise still had flaws, beachhead logistics coordination was still chaotic, and radio communications occasionally failed. But everyone could clearly see that the entire tactical system was now capable of operating in concert. Naval gunfire continuously covered infantry advances, underwater reconnaissance teams completed surveys in advance, landing craft navigated channels precisely, and tracked amphibious vehicles crossed reefs smoothly. At that moment, the tactics finally demonstrated real combat value. 6 years, 7 major exercises, with Zyro media coverages, recommendations. Tactical theory could only shed the label of empty talk through repeated failures and corrections on simulated beachheads. Holland Smith poured his heart into this work, and the years of peace were rapidly running out. On December 7, 1940-1, Pearl Harbor was attacked. America desperately needed a mature beach landing doctrine, and there was no time to lose. The landing operations manual that had been gathering dust for 7 years immediately became the official training doctrine of the Marine Corps. The United States Army soon issued its own amphibious warfare manual, and its content was virtually identical to the 1930-4 Marine Corps version. This set of tactical concepts, born in a Quantico classroom, refined through repeated discussion, and corrected through countless trial and error exercises on Caribbean beaches, quietly crossed service boundaries and became the core foundation for joint amphibious operations across both major branches of the American military. 3 years later, when the Normandy landings began, Nearly 160,000 Allied troops launched the largest amphibious assault in the history of warfare. The entire set of tactics used by the Allies all traced back to that classroom at Quantico, but this connection was never reported in the press. On the day of the Normandy landings, no media outlets brought out Holland Smith for an interview. He was in the Pacific Theater at the time, preparing for the next landing operation. When America entered the war, Smith was already 50-9 years old. This veteran, who had spent 7 years building the amphibious warfare system, organizing exercises, confronting failures, and making constant corrections, was not assigned to command the historic landing battles that would be recorded in the annals of war. His mission was to oversee amphibious warfare training across the entire Pacific Theater, turning thousands of young soldiers with no combat experience into qualified landing warriors, teaching them what to do when the ramp dropped on a landing craft and seawater rose above their chests. He stood behind the scenes, sharpening the fighting spirit for one hard battle after another, rather than standing at the center of the battlefield himself. On November 20th, 1940-3, the battle for Betio Island in the Tarawa et al. Began. The island was 2 miles long and less than half a mile wide, defended by 4,500 Japanese troops. Over 500 reinforced concrete bunkers and firing positions had been built on the island, enough to withstand even the most intense naval bombardment. The Japanese commander even boasted that even if the Americans sent 1 million men, they could not take Tarawa in 100 years. To back up this claim, he had spent more than a year painstakingly constructing defensive fortifications. Just before dawn, American naval guns opened fire first, bombarding the island for more than 2 hours. After minus action reports would later calculate that 3 million tons of ammunition were poured onto this tiny island. According to pre-minus battle projections, the island's defenses should have been completely destroyed. But then the unexpected happened. The tide that day was abnormal. The combination of the moon's position and wind conditions caused the water level to be far lower than the tide tables had predicted. The reefs surrounding the island, which should have been submerged beneath the water, were now almost exposed at the surface. Landing craft ran aground mass 800 yards from the beach. Soldiers had no choice but to jump overboard into the water. At first the water was chest-minus deep, and it grew shallower as they approached shore, but the entire 800 yards of water was fully exposed to enemy fire. The concrete bunkers remained intact, and the Japanese soldiers inside were ready and waiting. The first wave of landing troops suffered 70-5% casualties before they even set foot on dry land. The bombardment had lasted only a little over 2 hours and relied primarily on high-minus explosive shells, completely violating the doctrine's requirements for extended bombardment and armor-minus piercing ammunition. No underwater reconnaissance teams had been sent to survey the reef conditions at low tide, and the military was completely unaware of the danger. Tracked amphibious landing vehicles were in critically short supply. The procurement request from 3 years earlier had long since been rejected. For 17-6 hours of bloody fighting, over 1,000 American soldiers were killed. The Americans eventually took Tarawa, but those who lived through it said the battle was so brutal it could never be fully described. The media extensively reported the bravery and heroism of the Marines, which was certainly true, but it also obscured the real truth. The soldiers who fell to enemy fire in the water 800 yards from shore, who died without ever firing a single shot, were not defeated by the strength of the Japanese defenders. They were lost to layers of oversight in pre-minus battle preparation. When Tara was after-minus action report reached the General Staff, everyone understood the problem. This was not about the Marines lacking fighting capability. It was about gaps in preparation, and these were the exact same gaps that Holland Smith had been repeatedly emphasizing on demanding be fixed since 1930-4. When planning the Kwajalein operation, the staff used Tarawa's lessons as a guide and made 5 major adjustments based on the old doctrine, extending naval bombardment to a full 3 days and switching entirely to armor-mine, the piercing shells. Attacking from the weaker lagoon side, first capturing outlying islands to deploy artillery for shore-to-minus shore fire support, sending underwater reconnaissance teams 2 days before the landing to map reefs and clear obstacles, and providing sufficient tracked amphibious vehicles to ensure the first wave could cross reefs regardless of tide conditions. And all 5 of these adjustments were already written the 1930- for tactical doctrine. On February 1st, 1940-4, the Kwajalein et al. Campaign began. This island was larger, and Japanese garrison strength and defensive fortifications were comparable to Tarawa. The Americans executed the full, optimized tactical package: 3 days of sustained armor, minus piercing bombardment, underwater reconnaissance completed 2 days before landing, reefs and obstacles fully cleared, assault from the lagoon, outlying island artillery providing coordinated support, and tracked amphibious vehicles moving without obstruction. Landing craft never ran aground far from shore again. Soldiers did not have to jump into deep water and face machine gun fire. The landing process was executed exactly as the tactical doctrine prescribed. War is always cruel, and soldiers still lost their lives, but the difference in casualty numbers spoke volumes. At Tarawa, over 1,000 Americans were killed. At Kwajalein, only 370-2. 620-8 soldiers got to go home alive because of these changes. Most of these survivors had no idea who Holland Smith was. He had not been on the battlefield either. He was still working quietly behind the scenes on training and preparation. In the subsequent campaigns of Saipan, Tinian, and Iwo Jima, and every other major Pacific landing operation, this tactical system was continuously employed and refined. In June 1940-4, the Saipan campaign saw over 70,000 American troops land on an island of unprecedented scale. The Japanese garrison far exceeded intelligence estimates, with nearly 30,000 defenders holding advantageous terrain in a determined resistance. The battle lasted 20- for days, and 3,000 Americans were killed. The casualty numbers were still heavy, but the tactical system kept the losses to a minimum. In February 1940-5, the Iwo Jima campaign sent nearly 70,000 Americans against a volcanic island of only 8 square miles. 20-1,000 Japanese defenders had dug 11 miles of tunnels into the mountain, and naval gunfire could not reach the underground fortifications at all. After 30-6 days of bloody fighting, nearly 7,000 Americans were killed. No tactical system could make Iwo Jima easy, but this system ensured that landing troops had adequate ammunition, landing vehicles could move freely, and fire support was coordinated throughout, reducing what would have been even more catastrophic casualties to a manageable level. The soldiers who fought and bled on these beaches operated according to the doctrine they had trained on. The vast majority had no idea where this tactical system came from. They only knew what to do the moment the ramp dropped on their landing craft. On May 15, 1940-6, Holland Smith officially retired. He was not present at the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri, and his image cannot be found in any of the iconic victory photographs. That August, he was awarded the rank of full general upon retirement. In 1940-9, he published his memoirs, Coral and Brass. The writing was blunt and candid, pulling no punches. He stated directly that multiple battles had caused unnecessary casualties due to inadequate preparation, openly opposed certain decisions by his superiors, and pointed out that insufficient pre-battle bombardment, rejected landing vehicle procurement requests, and denied military budget applications were major reasons for the heavy casualties at Tarawa and elsewhere. He used no extreme language. He simply stated what he had observed, just as he had recorded exercise failures years before. The military brass did not appreciate this candid account, and the book sold poorly. On January 12, 1960-7, 80-year-old Holland McTyeire Smith passed away at the San Diego Naval Hospital. From his enlistment in 1905 to the end of his life, 60-2 years were inextricably linked to the Marine Corps, the service he had joined only because the Army turned him away. He was laid to rest at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery, His grave situated on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, the very ocean he had spent 30 years studying how to cross. No island or battle was ever named after him. No Smith formula or tactical theorem appears in military textbooks. No classic historical footage features his image. But next to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, the headquarters of Marine Forces Pacific was named Camp Holland Smith. This is not a battlefield, not a beachhead, not a moment of triumphant glory. It is the common center where everything was planned before the guns ever fired, the rear position that stood firm before the cameras arrived and long after they departed. That is where his name ultimately endures. History remembers a pantheon of famous generals: the commander at Guadalcanal, MacArthur returning to the Philippines, Nimitz at Midway. Their achievements were extraordinary and they deserve to be celebrated. But behind the Pacific War were countless unsung heroes like Holland Smith, men who worked in the peacetime years between two world wars with limited budgets and no public attention. Solely so that future soldiers heading into battle would not repeat the catastrophe of Gallipoli. His accomplishments never drew attention to themselves. 6 years of winter exercises, 7 rounds of trial and error, report after report of corrections, step by step refining the tactics. This was a calling that had nothing to do with glory. It was driven only by his conviction that the desperate situation soldiers faced in 1930- could be changed. So he spent 7 years quietly building a better tactical system, whether anyone was watching or not. Returning to the 2 sets of numbers from the beginning: over 1,000 killed at Tarawa, 370- to at Kwajalein, 620- who came home alive. The names of those soldiers are remembered only by their families. Holland Smith's name is known only to military historians. Yet it was this obscure old general who brought back 620- living souls. Famous generals have their battles and iconic photographs. Holland Smith had 620- ordinary people who got to reunite with their families. They returned to small towns across America, comforting mothers who had spent endless days in dread, wives who had waited with anxious hope, and children who had not seen their fathers in so long. The stories of over 600 reunions with no one knowing the hero behind them, that is the fate of those who build foundations. The world cannot see the foundation, but it can see the building standing tall. His name may never appear on the marquee of any war movie, but the 620- people who got to go home to their families because of him are his most genuine medal, and the most profound and enduring tribute history has given to this unsung old general. If you want more stories about the unsung heroes who shaped history from the shadows, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I am your strategy observer, and I will see you on the next battlefield of history.